"The wedding's off," the lawyer said, and he said it the way men say things they've rehearsed in a mirror, smooth and final, like he was doing her a kindness by getting it over with quickly. Marion Hattersley stood on the porch of the Brennan and Cole law office with her gloves still on and her trunk still strapped to the back of the wagon that had carried her from the train depot. And she felt the ground tilt the way it did sometimes on the crossing over the Kansas plains. That long, sick lurch when the wagon hit a rut, and everything in your stomach disagreed with everything in your head. She had traveled 6 days to get here. 6 days of trains, and one terrible night in a boarding house in Dodge City where the walls were thin enough that she'd heard a man crying 2 rooms down and hadn't been able to decide if that was a bad omen or just what loneliness sounded like out here, freely, without an audience. "I beg your pardon," she said, because there was nothing else to say that wouldn't sound like begging, and she had promised herself on the train, somewhere around Hutchinson, that she would not beg for anything ever again as long as she lived. "Mr. Calder passed 11 days ago," the lawyer said. His name was Joseph Pruitt, and he had the particular look of a man who spent his days moving other people's money around and had stopped being surprised by anything money did to people. Heart. Sudden. "We sent a wire, but I expect you were already on the train by then." "I was already on the train," Marion said, and heard her own voice come out flat and strange, like it belonged to someone standing slightly behind her. She had not loved Thomas Calder. She wanted that understood, even now, even to herself, standing on a porch in a town called Larkspur Hollow, with the late afternoon sun doing something gold and indifferent to the dust in the street. She had agreed to marry a rancher she had exchanged 11 letters with, because her mother had died in March, and her father's mind had started slipping sideways sometime after that, calling her by her dead sister's name, forgetting which year it was, and the house in Springfield had needed selling to pay for a place that could care for him properly, and there had been nothing left over for her. 26 years old, unmarried, with a father who no longer always knew her face, and a string of letters from a Kansas rancher who wrote like a careful, decent, unromantic man, and she had thought, that will do, that will be enough, a roof, a name, decency, if not love, and now there was no roof, no name. Just 11 letters that had promised her a life, and a dead man's lawyer standing on a porch, telling her the life had ended before it began. "There is the matter of the ranch," Pruitt said, and something in the way he said it made Marion go very still, the way she had learned to go still around her father in his bad months, watching for what came next before it arrived. "What matter?" Calder left no will that accounted for a wife who hadn't yet married him. The ranch passes to his nephew by the terms of an older will, man named Holt Calder. He's been running the place these last 2 years anyway, Thomas being more interested in the cattle than the books. Pruitt cleared his throat in the manner of a man arriving at the unpleasant part. "I am sorry to say there is nothing here for you, Miss Hattersley. I can arrange your passage back east if that would." "No," Marion said before she had decided to say it. She did not have a plan. She wanted to be honest with herself about that, standing there with the gold light going long and orange across the false-fronted buildings of a town she had arrived in with $40 and one trunk and a future that had evaporated somewhere between Hutchinson and here. She did not have a plan. She had only the bone-deep, immovable refusal to get back on a train and arrive in Springfield, having failed at the one thing she'd set out to do, to watch her father not recognize her in a home she could no longer afford, to have spent her last hope on a 6-day train ride toward a dead man. "There's a boarding house," Pruitt said carefully, watching her in the particular way men watched women who weren't behaving the way they expected. "Mrs. Ferris keeps it decent. I could walk you over." "Thank you," Marion said. "I can find it myself." She picked up her trunk strap and did not let her hands shake, and she walked down the steps of the law office into the street of a town that had never expected her and now didn't know what to do with her. And she told herself, the way she had told herself on the stagecoach, on the train, in the boarding house in Dodge City with the crying man 2 rooms over, that she had been afraid of the wrong thing the whole way out here. She had been afraid of marrying a stranger. She had never once considered being afraid of having no one at all. If you're listening to this tonight from wherever you are, drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story has traveled by the time it's done. And stay with Marion all the way to the end. What she finds in Larkspur Hollow is not what she came for, and it is not what she expects, And the difference between those two things is the whole of what this story is about. Mrs. Ferris's boarding house sat at the end of the main street where the buildings thinned out, and the prairie took over again, a square clapboard structure with a porch that sagged slightly on the left side, like a person favoring an old injury. Marion paid for 3 nights with money she could not afford to spend on 3 nights, and Mrs. Ferris, a wide, capable woman in her 50s with flour, permanently worked into the creases of her knuckles, looked at her with an expression Marion was coming to recognize as the particular sympathy reserved for women who arrived in towns without anyone to claim them. "You're the Calder bride," Mrs. Ferris said. It wasn't a question. Word traveled in towns like this the way water traveled downhill, fast and along the path of least resistance. And Marion understood by the set of the woman's mouth that her situation was already known, already discussed, already filed away into whatever category Larkspur Hollow kept for unfortunate women. "I was going to be," Marion said. Mrs. Ferris set a key on the counter. "Rooms at the top of the stairs. Supper's at 6, and you're welcome to it whether you can pay for it or not, tonight at least. You look like a woman who hasn't eaten properly since Missouri." Marion almost laughed. It came out instead as something closer to a held breath finally released. Not quite a sob, not quite relief. Just the sound a person makes when a stranger has correctly identified a kindness they badly needed and offered it without being asked twice. She did not sleep well that first night. She lay in the narrow bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a Kansas town settling into darkness, a dog, somewhere, and the wind working at a loose shutter, and once, distantly, the sound of a piano being played badly and cheerfully in what she assumed was the saloon, and she did the arithmetic of her situation over and over without arriving anywhere new. $40, no husband, no position. A father in Springfield who needed money she did not have and would not have soon, possibly would not have at all. Depending on what Larkspur Hollow turned out to offer a woman with no family here and no particular skills beyond what a well-raised from Springfield, Illinois had been taught. Needlework. Penmanship, the management of a household she no longer had. She thought, somewhere near 3 in the morning, about going home. She let herself think it fully, all the way through, what it would mean. The train back. The look on the matron's face at her father's care home when she explained she had no more money. The particular humiliation of having spent her last resources chasing a husband who'd had the bad manners to die before she arrived. She thought it through, and then she set it down, the way she had learned to set down thoughts that did her no good. And in the morning, she went looking for work. The dress shop on Larkspur Hollow's Main Street belonged to a sharp-eyed widow named Constance Whitfield, who took one look at Marion's careful stitching on the hem of her own traveling dress and said, "I can pay you $8 a month and you'll sleep in the back room," which is more than most of the men who own ranches around here would offer a woman in your situation. So don't go thinking you've been insulted. Marion had not thought she'd been insulted. Marion had thought, looking at the small clean room behind the shop, with its single window facing the alley and its narrow bed, and the smell of fabric dye that would, she suspected, never fully leave her clothes again, that she had been handed exactly what she needed and had no right to want more than that. She took the position. She wrote to her father's care home, explaining a delay in funds and promising more by autumn. A promise she had no immediate way of keeping and made anyway, because the alternative was admitting she had none to make. She learned the rhythms of Larkspur Hollow the way a person learns a new language, by immersion and small humiliations. The dry goods store ran out of good thread by Wednesday most weeks. The Baptist church and the Methodist church held an unspoken rivalry over which had the better social calendar. Everyone in town, it seemed, already knew that Marion Hattersley was the bride a dead man had failed to marry, and they regarded her with the particular mixture of pity and suspicion that small towns reserved for women whose stories didn't have tidy endings yet. It was in the 3rd week, on a Tuesday, that she met Holt Calder. She did not know it was him at first. She had gone to deliver a finished dress to a ranch family 8 miles outside town. Constance trusted her with deliveries now, a small earned graduation from the back room, and the road took her past a stretch of fence where a man was working alone, resetting a post that had rotted at the base. His shirt dark with sweat down the spine, and his hat pushed back enough that she could see he was younger than she'd expected, somewhere near her own age, or perhaps a few years past it, with the kind of weathered, unhurried competence in his hands that came from work rather than performance. He looked up when her wagon passed, and there was a long moment where neither of them said anything, where he simply looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately place. Not curiosity exactly, and not the assessing look men gave unmarried women in towns like this, but something quieter, like recognition of a fact he'd already half expected. "You'd be Miss Hattersley," he said. Marion's hands tightened on the reins. "I would," Holt called her. He didn't move toward the wagon, didn't extend a hand he'd have had to cross the road to offer, and she found she was grateful for that, for the distance he left intact. "Thomas was my uncle." It took her a moment 10 to find the right words, the proper words, the words that wouldn't sound like an accusation about a ranch and an inheritance that had never been hers to lose. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said finally, which was true, and which was also the only safe thing she could think to say. "He thought highly of you," Holt said. "Read me parts of your letters some evenings. Said you wrote like a woman who didn't waste words." He considered her for another moment, and something in his face shifted, settled into a kind of plain decency that she would come, over the following months, to understand was simply the whole of his character, undecorated and unchanging. "I'm sorry the way it went. I am. It wasn't right, you traveling all that way and finding what you found." "It wasn't anyone's doing," Marion said. "Not yours, certainly, no." He looked back at the fence post for a moment, then back at her. "Still sits wrong with me. You needing anything, you ask in town. Folks'll point you to the Calder place. I mean that plainly." He went back to his work then, without ceremony, without lingering for her response, and Marion drove on toward the ranch family's house, with a strange, unsettled feeling she didn't examine closely, because examining it felt like inviting a complication she had no room for. She had $40, and a dress shop position, and a father in Springfield, and no business at all, noticing the particular quality of a stranger's plainness, the way Holt Calder had said what he meant, and then stopped talking, instead of saying what was expected and continuing to talk past it the way most men did. She did not see him again for 6 weeks. The 6 weeks were not unkind to her, exactly, though they wore at her in the particular way that genteel poverty wears at a person. Not dramatic, not the stuff of crisis, but a slow grinding accumulation of small calculations. Whether she could afford new thread for her own mending, or whether the old, weaker thread would hold one more season. Whether the letter she sent to Springfield, with its careful, hopeful lies about funds forthcoming, would buy her father another month of decent care, or whether the home would write back with the kind of polite, final letter she dreaded. Constance Whitfield was not unkind, but she was not generous either, beyond the $8 in the room, and Marion understood that the arrangement worked because it benefited them both equally, no more, no less. She made one friend in those weeks, a woman named Hazel Bryce, who ran the telegraph office and had the dry, unbothered manner of someone who'd long ago stopped expecting Larkspur Hollow to surprise her. Hazel had a way of saying exactly what she thought without seeming to notice she was doing it, which Marion found, after a childhood and young womanhood spent among people who said things sideways and expected you to translate, enormously restful. "You're thinner than when you got here," Hazel observed one evening, when Marion stopped by the telegraph office on her way back from a delivery, ostensibly to send a wire to Springfield, but really, if she was honest, because she'd started looking forward to the 10 minutes of conversation Hazel offered free of charge. "Constance starving you, or are you starving yourself out of some notion that you don't deserve to eat well since you're a charity case?" "I'm not a charity case," Marion said, with more heat than she'd intended. "No," Hazel agreed, unbothered. "You're a woman supporting a sick father on $8 a month, while everyone in this town whispers about the bride the dead man stood up. I withdraw the word charity. It was unkind. But you are thin, and you should eat the eggs, Mrs. Ferris keeps trying to send over, instead of saving the money." Marion had laughed, that time a real laugh, the first one she remembered having since Springfield, and she'd thought, walking back to the dress shop in the blue early evening, that she had perhaps underestimated how much a person needed one honest friend in a strange place, more than they needed almost anything else the place could offer. She thought of Holt Calder more than she meant to in those 6 weeks, in the unguarded moments before sleep. In the particular way his voice had stayed level and unhurried even when he was apologizing for something that wasn't his fault. She told herself it meant nothing. She had come to Kansas to marry a stranger for practical reasons, and that practical arrangement had collapsed, and there was no version of her current life that had room in it for noticing a rancher's plainness, his eyes, the unhurried competence of his hands at a fence post-it. She had learned, since March, since her mother's death, and her father's slipping mind and the long unraveling of everything she'd built her life around, that wanting things was a luxury she could not currently afford, and so she did not let herself want this. Whatever this was, beyond the small, contained, manageable space of noticing it and setting it down. It was Hazel, in the end, who forced the matter, in the offhand way Hazel forced most matters. "Holt Calder's been asking after you," she said one evening in late September, not looking up from the telegraph key. "3 times now," asked Mrs. Ferris how you were settling. Asked me, of all people, whether you'd had any luck finding steadier work than the dress shop. Man doesn't ask after people he isn't thinking about, Marion. I've lived in this town 11 years and I've never once heard Holt Calder ask after anybody. He feels responsible, Marion said. For what happened with the ranch. He feels something, Hazel said, but I'd lay money it isn't responsibility. Responsibility doesn't make a man redden at the ears, the way Wade Tilford said he reddened, mentioning your name at the feed store. Marion did not know what to do with this information, so she did what she had been doing with most difficult information since March. She set it aside and went back to work. She saw him again at the Harvest Social in October, an event the whole town turned out for. Strung lanterns over the church lawn and tables of food contributed by every household with a working stove, and Marion had come because Constance had insisted it was bad for business for her seamstress to seem unsociable, and because Hazel had threatened to drag her there bodily if necessary. Holt Calder was standing near the edge of things, the way she suspected he stood near the edge of most social occasions. Not unfriendly but unhurried about joining in. And when his eyes found hers across the lantern light, something passed between them that neither of them moved to act on for the better part of an hour. Both of them circling the edges of conversations with other people. Both of them, she suspected, perfectly aware of where the other one stood. It was Hazel again, who broke the standoff, taking Marion firmly by the elbow and walking her directly to where Holt stood, with a plate of food he didn't appear to be eating. "Holt Calder, you've asked after this woman 3 separate times in the last month, and she's standing right here, so I am going to leave the two of you to manage a conversation like adults instead of orbiting each other at every gathering in this town like a pair of nervous planets." And then, with the particular efficiency of a woman who had said her piece and had no further use for the scene, Hazel walked away toward the dessert table. There was a silence that Marion, 6 months ago, would have rushed to fill with something polite and forgettable. She let it sit instead. "I owe you an apology," Holt said finally, "for asking after you behind your back like a man too cowardly to ask to your face." "You're asking now," Marion said. "I am." He set the plate down on the nearest table, freeing his hands for nothing in particular, the way a man does when he wants to seem like he has somewhere to put his nervousness. "I've thought a good deal these last weeks about the position you were left in. Coming all this way for a life that wasn't there to find. And I want to say plainly, because I don't know another way to say things, I've thought about it more than the situation alone accounts for. I think about you generally. Not just the unfairness of what happened." Marion felt something in her chest that she recognized, distantly, as the same cold terror she'd felt standing on the porch of the law office the day she arrived. Not because this was bad news, but because it was the precise opposite. And she had spent 6 months training herself not to want things, and here was a decent, plain-spoken man telling her, in the only language he apparently knew how to use, that he wanted her to want this. "I have a father in Springfield," she said, because it was the truest, most practical thing she could offer him, the thing that would either end this conversation or prove he meant what he said. "A sick father, who needs money I don't currently have. I came to Kansas to solve a problem, Mr. Calder, not to fall in love with one of its ranchers." "I know it," Holt said, "and I'd not ask you to choose between him and anything I might offer. I've got land enough and cattle enough that your father could come live near us, if that's what you wanted, and I'd see he had proper care, and I'd never once hold it over you as a debt you owed me for it. That's not how I'm built. I don't know how to want a thing from a person and also keep accounts on what it cost me to give them what they needed." Marion looked at him for a long moment in the lantern light, at the plain, unhurried decency of his face, and she thought of Thomas Calder's 11 letters, careful and unromantic, promising safety without ever once promising this particular, unhurried, undemanding attention, offered without conditions, without an account being kept. "I don't know you," she said. "Not really. 6 weeks of seeing you twice." "No," he agreed. "But I'd like the chance to be known, however long that takes. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight, Miss Hattersley. I'm only asking you not to go on avoiding me at church socials, like I'm a debt you're trying not to think about." She laughed despite herself, a real laugh that surprised them both, and something in the tightness she'd been carrying since the porch of the law office eased, just slightly, just enough that she could feel the difference. "I'll stop avoiding you," she said. "I make no other promises tonight." "That'll do," Holt said, and there was something in the way he said it. That's fast, she thought, almost, but not quite, the words from Thomas's letters, and she understood in that moment the particular sideways way that grief and disappointment sometimes clear a path toward something better than what was lost. That's fast, and yet it didn't feel fast at all. It felt like the first true thing that had happened to her since March. What followed was not a whirlwind, and Marion was grateful for that, because she did not think she had the constitution left for a whirlwind. It was instead a slow accumulation of Tuesdays and Sundays, of Holt finding reasons to be in town on the days she worked, of small kindnesses extended without fanfare, a delivery of good thread to the dress shop with no note attached, until Constance mentioned offhand that the rancher had paid for it himself, a wagon ride home from church that turned into a habit neither of them named, a long evening in November when he sat with her on Mrs. Ferris's porch and told her, without being asked, about his own mother's death when he was 12, and the particular loneliness of being raised by an uncle who loved him well, but didn't know how to talk about anything that mattered. "I understood Thomas better after that conversation than I did in 11 letters." Marion told Hazel, who had become, by November, the closest thing to family Marion had within 1,000 miles. "That's because letters are for telling people what you want them to think of you," Hazel said. "Porches are for telling them the truth." It was on one such evening, in early December, with the first hard frost already silvering the grass and Marion's breath showing white in the porch light, that she told Holt the truth about her father, not the careful, managed version she'd given him at the harvest social, but the whole of it, the way her father sometimes called her by her dead sister's name, the way his hands shook now when he tried to write, the way she had not been able to afford to visit him since arriving in Kansas, and carried that absence like a stone she could not set down. Holt listened without interrupting, which she had learned by then was simply how he listened to everything, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "I'll wire money for a visit," he said. "Not as a gift you owe me for. As a thing a man does for a woman he intends to marry, when her father is sick and far away and she hasn't seen him in 8 months. You haven't asked me to marry you," Marion said, with the particular dryness she'd learned from Hazel. "No," Holt agreed, and there was something almost like a smile in the dark. "I'm working up to it properly. I had a notion it ought to involve a ring and a question, instead of just announcing my intentions sideways on a cold porch. But since we're being honest tonight, yes, I intend to. When you're ready to hear it asked properly." Marion sat with that for a long moment, feeling the cold air and the warmth of him beside her, and the strange unfamiliar sensation of being wanted by someone who had nothing to gain from the wanting, who had, if anything, more reason than most men to resent her, the dress shop girl who'd come to marry his uncle and somehow ended up, 6 months later, sitting on a porch with him instead. "I'd like to hear it asked properly," she said. "Someday. Not tonight. Tonight I'd just like to sit here." "That'll do," Holt said again, and this time she understood the phrase completely. Not an ending, not a settling for something less than what she'd wanted, but the plain, undecorated truth of a thing being exactly enough. She visited her father in February, with money Holt had wired without ceremony and without expectation, and found him diminished in ways that broke her heart and steadied her resolve in equal measure. His hands trembled badly now, and there were whole afternoons, the matron told her gently, when he didn't speak at all, just sat by the window watching something only he could see. But there was one clear hour, on her second day there, when his eyes found hers and held, really held, the way they used to, and he said her name correctly, said it like he knew exactly who she was, and asked her, with sudden and startling clarity, whether she'd found someone good out there in Kansas. "I have, Papa," she said, and found she was crying, the good kind of crying, the kind that didn't hurt going down. "Good," her father said. "Don't you let pride keep you from a good thing, Marion. I let pride keep your mother and me from a good many good things over the years. Don't you do that?" It was the last lucid conversation they had. By the time she left 3 days later, he had slipped back into the fog that had been claiming him since March, and did not seem to know her, and she held his hand anyway and told him she loved him and that she would be back, and she did not know, riding the train back toward Kansas, whether that was a promise she would be able to keep. But she knew it was a promise she intended to make true as many times as she possibly could, for as long as he had left to hear it. Holt met her at the depot, which she had not expected, and which undid something in her chest the moment she saw him standing there in the cold, with his hat in his hands, not performing anything, just present, just there, the way he had been present since the harvest social, without conditions, without an account being kept. "How is he?" Holt asked, taking her trunk before she could lift it herself. "Diminished," Marion said, "but he knew me for an hour. He told me not to let pride keep me from a good thing." She looked at Holt directly, in the gray winter light of the depot platform, and felt the last of her careful 6-month caution simply give way, the way ice gives way in a thaw, not dramatically. Just a quiet final yielding to something that had been pressing against it all along. "I don't intend to." "No?" Holt said, and there was something careful and hopeful in his voice that she had not heard from him before, not even on the porch in December. "No," Marion said. "Ask me properly," Holt called her. "I'm ready to hear it." He did not have a ring with him. He told her later, laughing, that he'd had one in his coat pocket for 3 weeks waiting for the right moment, and had somehow, in the rush of meeting her train, left his coat at the ranch. But he asked her anyway. Right there on the depot platform with the cold coming down and her trunk still sitting between them, asked her plainly and without decoration, the way he did everything, and Marion Hattersley, who had come to Kansas 6 months earlier to marry a stranger, out of necessity, and had found instead a man who wanted her for no reason that served him, said yes before he had even finished the question. They were married in April, in the little church with the lantern-lit lawn, where they'd first truly spoken, with Hazel standing up for her and Mrs. Ferris crying openly in the second pew, and Constance Whitfield, who had grumbled the whole month about losing her best seamstress, presenting her with a wedding dress she'd sewn herself, in secret, in the evenings after the shop closed, refusing to accept a single dollar for it. Marion's father did not live to see the wedding. He passed in March quietly in his sleep. In the home Holt's money had kept him in with dignity through the worst of it, but Marion carried his last clear words with her down the aisle like something solid she could hold on to. "Don't let pride keep you from a good thing." She did not. A year later, standing on the porch of the house Holt had built onto the original ranch house that spring, watching the light go long and gold across land that was now in every way that mattered, hers, chosen, not assigned, built, not inherited, loved, not merely accepted out of necessity. Marion thought sometimes of that first terrible day, standing outside the lawyer's office with her trunk at her feet and her future evaporated in front of her. She had been so certain that day that she had lost everything worth having. She understood now, with the particular clarity of a woman, looking back at the worst day of her life, from the safety of the other side of it, that she had only lost the smaller thing she'd been settling for, to make room for the larger thing she hadn't yet known to want. She had feared arriving with nothing. She had built, instead, a life that was entirely her own, beside a man who had never once asked her to be less than she was, who had loved her plainly and without an account being kept. From the very first conversation on a dusty road outside a fence post he hadn't needed to stop and apologize for. That was the whole of it, in the end. Not rescue, not safety handed to her by a man with nothing to gain from the giving. A life she had chosen, built with her own hands on the wreckage of a different plan entirely, and a man beside her who had simply, plainly, completely, without reservation said, "That's your house, that's your life, yours entirely," and meant it, every single day, exactly enough.